Prime Minister Sunak saying that far too many appalling examples of anti-Semitism, violent intimidation and the glorification of terrorism have occurred during these protests that have gone on since the 7th of October. There have been more than 1,000 protests and vigils since that date, with more than 26,000 police officer shifts between the 7th of October and the 17th of December alone, and that's brought about 600 arrests. So many people are saying that this is really very little and too late. Indeed, he fired Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, for calling these hate marches and her hard line on the marches. And there's also been discussion between the Prime Minister and the police. He of course, wrote to the police, to Mark Rowley, the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, just a few months ago, reminding him that he has the ability to ask the government to ban a particular march. That was when they were planning to march against Israel on Armistice Day. Of course, the police didn't ask for that permission to ban the march. So there's a bit of a disconnection between the police and the government. And this, I think, is his attempt to try to redress that, to put in place a few new extra measures that could be used against protests.
Right. And what has been the reaction? And as you mentioned before, there have been those voices like Suella Braverman and others that have been saying the police and the government needs to be tougher against this incitement, this intimidation by these demonstrators. What has been the reaction to these moves being made today by the or suggestions by the Prime Minister?
Well, there are actually plenty of people who are against this sort of thing, saying that it limits people's freedom of expression and freedom to protest. Of course, what they're talking about as well is relatively limited in terms of dealing with the protests from the perspective of many Jewish people who are afraid to go out onto the streets of central London during Saturdays when these marches are going on. He says he asked the police what measures and powers they needed, and that those measures are going to be added to the criminal justice bill that's currently being considered by Parliament, but that then could get held up in the House of Lords. It could get changed again. And all it really says is that demonstrators who refuse to remove face masks could be jailed for a month and fined up to £1,000, that people joining the protests will be banned from carrying fireworks, flares, smoke bombs and smoke canisters and other pyrotechnics, and that anyone carrying items like that or climbing on war memorials can be arrested. This isn't, of course, just aimed at anti-Israel protests. We've seen plenty of disruptive protesters like those from Just Stop Oil and other environmental groups causing great upheaval in Great Britain and gluing themselves to roads and things like that, which has, of course, stopped other people's freedoms to go about their own lives, regardless of their freedom to protest. But generally speaking, it's not clear that any of this will do very much to make Jewish people or others feel safer on the streets, because the police simply don't use some of the powers they already have to arrest people when they're, say, calling for jihad on the streets of London or waving a black Shahada flag, which is often used by jihadi groups. These things haven't necessarily resulted in arrests, and even people without their faces covered haven't been arrested, with the police later issuing photos on social media asking people to help them find the perpetrators. So it's not entirely clear whether this is just Rishi Sunak trying to talk tough on a video there, which looked a bit like he was making that statement at gunpoint, it has to be said, or whether or not this is actually the beginning of a tougher regime in terms of policing the protests and standing up against them.
All right.